A war between worlds, a love that defies the stars, a battle that changes everything. Welcome to Alien Love Chronicles, where we bring you the most captivating interstellar love stories, filled with passion, betrayal, and impossible choices. Today's story will take you to the edge of the universe, to a battlefield where a warrior fights for his people, only to find himself trapped between what he was and what he is becoming. What happens when a human soldier and an immortal queen, sworn enemies, find their fates intertwined? What if love is the greatest rebellion of all? This is a story you won't want to miss. Stay until the very end to witness the breathtaking conclusion, one that will leave you questioning everything you know about love, power, and destiny. Before we dive in, if you enjoy thrilling, heart-wrenching sci-fi romance, help us reach 1,000 followers by leaving a like, sharing this video, and subscribing. Your support is the fuel that keeps us creating stories that take you beyond the stars. Now, prepare yourself for a journey unlike any other. The sky was burning. Flashes of crimson and gold streaked across the ruined heavens as warships clashed above, their energy cannons ripping apart what remained of the planetary defense grid. The once thriving colony of Vesper 9 had become little more than a graveyard. Twisted metal, smoldering craters, and the skeletal remains of skyscrapers that had once reached for the stars. The air was thick with smoke, carrying the acrid scent of scorched earth and something worse. Burning flesh, the last remnants of the Terra Defense Force. Gideon Kane crouched behind the wreckage of an armored transport, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The last commander of Earth's forces, and all that remained of his once mighty battalion. A handful of soldiers still fought in the ruins behind him, their movements desperate, their ammunition dwindling. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. "Sir, the eastern barricade is down!" A voice crackled through his damaged comm. It was Sergeant Hale, one of the few still alive. Gideon wiped blood from his brow, glancing toward the battlefield. Shadows moved between the wreckage, tall, inhuman figures with glowing silver eyes. The Celestials. They advanced with eerie precision, their sleek obsidian armor untouched by the carnage around them. Unlike humans, they did not rush. They did not panic. They did not fear. Gideon gritted his teeth, adjusting his grip on his rifle. If he was going to die, he would die fighting. "Hold your positions," he commanded. But even as he gave the order, he knew it was meaningless. The Celestial Queen had arrived. A ripple of silence fell over the battlefield as Nyxara descended from the ruined skyline, her presence more commanding than any explosion or battle cry. She moved through the destruction like a goddess stepping through the ashes of a dying world, her long dark cloak trailing behind her, untouched by the chaos. Her battle armor gleamed in the firelight, black as the void, etched with golden celestial runes that pulsed with ancient energy. In her grip was a weapon not of metal, but of something alive. Her plasma-forged blade, its edges shifting and glowing with an unnatural hunger. Gideon had heard the stories. The Immortal Queen of the Celestials, unbeaten, unchallenged, unstoppable. She stopped barely 20 feet from him, tilting her head slightly, as if studying the remnants of humanity before her. "You fight as if you have something to lose." Her voice carried across the ruins, rich and smooth, yet cold as the depths of space. "And yet, your kind lost this war before it even began." Gideon exhaled sharply. She was right. Humanity's last fleet had already fallen. The colonies were either conquered or obliterated. Earth itself, his home, had gone silent weeks ago. This battle was not a war. It was an execution. But he wasn't going to surrender. With a defiant roar, Gideon charged. His boots pounded against the rubble-strewn ground as he raised his rifle, finger tightening on the trigger. One last shot. One last chance to make her bleed. Nyxara barely moved. In an instant she vanished from sight, reappearing directly in front of him, moving with an impossible speed. Before Gideon could react, a searing light slashed through the air, her blade. Pain ignited through his body as the plasma sword cut through his armor, slicing into his side with precision just shy of lethal. The force of the blow sent him crashing onto his back, his weapon clattering uselessly against the rubble. He groaned, pressing a hand to his side. Not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to make him understand exactly how outmatched he was. Nyxara stood over him, her glowing blade mere inches from his throat. "Brave," she murmured, "but foolish." Gideon coughed, tasting iron in his mouth. "Go to hell." For the first time, her lips curved, not in amusement, not in cruelty, but in something that almost resembled intrigue. Slowly, she knelt beside him, one knee pressing against the debris as she studied his face. He expected a killing blow. Instead, she reached out, her fingers grazing the wound she had given him. A slow, deliberate touch. Her golden eyes narrowed. "You are different," she murmured. Gideon clenched his jaw. "Save your speeches and kill me already." Nyxara did not move. The blade in her hand pulsed with energy, humming softly, yet she hesitated. Why? Celestials never hesitated. Yet here she was, gazing at him with a look he could not decipher. Something had changed. A cold wind howled through the ruins, carrying the distant cries of dying men. The battle around them was ending. Or rather, humanity was ending. Still, she did not strike. Instead, she whispered, "No." Gideon frowned, his breath ragged. "No?" She exhaled, standing slowly, her blade retracting back into its hilt. "You are not ready to die yet, human." Before he could protest, a surge of energy hit him, Nyxara's power. A pulse of pure celestial force wrapped around his consciousness, drowning him in light. His vision blurred, his mind swaying between reality and something else. Something ancient, something cold and endless. And then, darkness. The last thing he saw before the world slipped away was her face, her golden eyes burning into his. For reasons he did not understand, the Immortal Queen had spared him. And in that moment, Gideon Kane's fate was no longer his own. The stars burned with the fury of war. The mighty Solvath Empire trembled as betrayal shattered its foundations. Once an unyielding queen, Ravenia now stands at the edge of oblivion. The enemy? Not just the traitor Kalar, but an ancient force lurking in the shadows of the universe. And at her side? Orion Vale, a human once bound in chains by her empire, now fighting to keep her alive. Two warriors, once enemies, now forced to trust each other in the ruins of a lost world. Survival is not guaranteed. Escape is nearly impossible. And love? That was never supposed to be part of the equation. But fate has other plans. Will they rewrite destiny? Or become another tragic tale lost among the stars? Watch Alien Love Chronicles and witness a love story that defies time, war, and the unknown. Stay until the end. You won't believe what happens next. And if you enjoy these interstellar tales, subscribe now and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. The void burned. Across the vast canvas of space, the battle unfolded like a violent storm, swallowing entire warships in torrents of plasma fire. Distant galaxies shimmered behind the chaos, their serene beauty eclipsed by the merciless spectacle of destruction. Oblivion Wrath, the pride of the Solvath Empire, loomed at the heart of it all, a behemoth of metal and energy, its golden hull once a symbol of sovereignty, now marred by fire and fractures. Around it, smaller cruisers spun wildly, their hulls splitting open like shattered glass, scattering bodies and debris into the endless abyss. On the bridge, Queen Ravenia stood unmoving, a pillar of defiance amid the carnage. The golden filigree of her battle armor gleamed under the flickering emergency lights, a stark contrast to the devastation unraveling around her. Her amber eyes, fierce and calculating, reflected the flames licking at the viewport. She was not afraid. She had never been afraid. And yet, a chill crept through her veins, a foreboding unlike anything she had felt in all her years of war. Because this disaster, was not the result of an external enemy. No, this was a blade driven into her back from within her own throne room. A sudden jolt rattled the bridge, sending crew members crashing against their consoles. Sparks erupted from exposed circuits, raining down in fiery cascades. The acrid scent of burning metal filled the air, mingling with the static crackle of failing communications. "Shields are down, Majesty," a tactical officer shouted over the alarms. "We're compromised, but it's coming from inside our systems." Inside. Ravenia's gaze snapped to the hollow display at the center of the bridge. A stream of code scrolled across the interface, weaving its way through the ship's core defenses like a serpent slithering through a crumbling temple. And at the heart of it, a royal access code. Her heartbeat slowed. Time itself seemed to shrink, the roaring of the battle beyond fading into a distant hum. There was only the flickering of the data before her, cold and unforgiving. The code was one she knew, one she had trusted. The ship lurched again, a deafening explosion erupting from the lower decks. The viewport momentarily went dark before emergency systems restored a dim, flickering glow. A new warning flashed across the screens. Engine room compromised. Then, through the static of the failing comms, a voice slithered into existence. Smooth. Familiar. Cold. "My dearest sister." The words curled like smoke through the bridge, seeping into every corner of the room, every shadow. Ravenia's jaw clenched, her fingers tightening against the railing. She knew that voice. Kalar, the brother she had once cradled in her arms as a child, the heir she had shielded from the brutal politics of the court, the blood of her blood, now a traitor. The holoscreen flickered, and his face appeared, sharp features carved from ice, a smirk curling at the corner of his lips. His eyes, the same shade of amber as hers, gleamed with something dark, something triumphant. "You've ruled for too long, Ravenia," he mused, his voice carrying the cruel amusement of a predator toying with its prey. "And yet, you've become soft." Static crackled through the comms, barely masking the distant screams from the lower decks, the sound of metal twisting under catastrophic failure. "I must admit, I expected more from you," Kalar continued, tilting his head slightly. "To think, the mighty Queen of Solvath, brought to her knees without ever seeing the blade coming." Ravenia exhaled slowly, controlled, despite the fury curling in her gut like a viper ready to strike. "You used the Empire's own systems against us," she said, her voice calm, but lethal. "Cowardice suits you, brother." Kylar's smile widened. "And arrogance has always suited you, sister. But let me ask you, did you truly think your reign could last forever? That your ideals of restraint and strategy could keep us strong?" His expression darkened. "You are a relic of a dying era, Ravenia. And I am the dawn of a new one." Another explosion ripped through the ship, and the lights flickered violently before stabilizing at half power. The Queen barely flinched, though her fingers curled into fists. The grand halls of the Celestial High Council stood untouched by war, a stark contrast to the smoldering ruins of the human colonies. The chamber itself was a marvel of immortal craftsmanship, a vast expanse of flowing, luminescent architecture that pulsed with faint golden veins. The walls shimmered like liquid crystal, reflecting the glow of a suspended celestial core hovering at the center. A miniature star, held in place by forces far beyond human comprehension. It was here that decisions spanning centuries were made, where the ruling elite of the Celestials dictated the fate of entire civilizations. And it was here that Lord Magnus planned his quiet rebellion. He stood at the far end of the chamber, watching the distorted reflection of himself ripple across the crystalline floor. His obsidian armor, intricately lined with gold, was unblemished, a stark contrast to the scars of battle that marked Nyxara's own. His expression remained impassive, but his thoughts churned with cold precision. She was failing. Once, their queen had been untouchable, her will as unbreakable as the stars themselves. But now she hesitated. Since the moment she had spared the human warrior, something had shifted in her, something dangerous. Magnus had watched, keen-eyed and patient, as Nyxara delayed executions, as she questioned battle strategies that had led them to victory for eons. Her fascination with Gideon Kane was more than just curiosity. It was weakness. The Celestials did not indulge weakness. A figure moved in the dim light beyond the suspended core. Dorian Velix stepped forward, his long, regal form cloaked in the traditional battle robes of the Celestial Command. Unlike Magnus, whose presence commanded silence, Dorian was the embodiment of poise, a loyalist in name, yet a skeptic in thought. "She is compromised," Magnus said without preamble. His voice was measured, controlled. He did not need to embellish. Dorian's expression remained unreadable. "She is cautious." "Caution is not our way," Magnus replied. "You have seen it. She wavers. And for what? A human." He let the word hang between them like an accusation. "We have crushed empires, reduced entire species to dust, and yet she hesitates over one mortal." Dorian remained silent for a moment, his gaze flickering toward the suspended core, its light casting shadows across his angular features. "She is considering alternatives." "Alternatives," Magnus repeated, his tone laced with disdain. "Our way has ensured dominance for millennia. There is no alternative." Dorian's jaw tightened, but he did not argue. He had known Nyxara longer than Magnus, had fought beside her through conflicts that had reshaped the very fabric of their dominion, but even he could not deny that something had changed. Magnus took a measured step forward, lowering his voice. "We are at a tipping point, Dorian. If she continues down this path, she will fracture our unity. There are whispers among the generals. If she is allowed to rule unchecked, she will undo what we have built." Dorian exhaled slowly, folding his hands behind his back. "And what do you propose?" Magnus studied him for a moment before speaking. "A restoration of order, of strength. We cannot allow sentiment to taint our rule." He let his words settle before delivering the final blow. "If she does not step aside willingly, she must be removed." Dorian's head snapped toward him, his golden eyes narrowing. "You speak of treason." "I speak of survival," Magnus corrected, stepping closer. "You are loyal, Dorian. I do not question that. But where does your loyalty lie? To a ruler who hesitates? Or to the empire that must endure beyond her failings?" Dorian's silence was answer enough. Magnus allowed a small, knowing smile to touch his lips. "The time is coming. When it does, you will have to choose." He turned, leaving Dorian standing in the glow of the celestial core, the weight of his words pressing heavy upon the commander's shoulders. In the private halls of the celestial stronghold, Nyxara stood at the edge of a vast overlook, her gaze locked on the horizon beyond the city of Alaris. From here, the capital stretched out in breathtaking splendor, towers of flowing metal and energy, suspended walkways glowing faintly beneath the eternal night sky. The city had stood for eons, its foundation unshaken by the passage of time. And yet, she could feel the fracture beneath it. The unrest among her ranks had not gone unnoticed. The way her council members lingered too long in whispered discussions, the way Magnus watched her with barely concealed judgment. Even Dorian, ever the steadfast general, had begun to question her. She had not needed to read their thoughts to know what they believed. That she had changed. Her fingers tightened around the rail. Had she? The presence behind her was silent but familiar. "You should be resting," Dorian said, stepping forward. "I have no need for rest," she replied without looking at him. For a moment he said nothing. Then, "They doubt you." She exhaled slowly. "They have always doubted." "This is different." She turned to him, her golden eyes searching his. "And you?" she asked. "Do you doubt me as well?" Dorian hesitated, just long enough for her to notice. Nyxara's gaze hardened, but there was no anger in it, only understanding. "Magnus has spoken to you." Dorian did not answer. He didn't need to. She turned back to the overlook, her expression unreadable. "And what do you think, Dorian?" she asked quietly. "Do you believe I have lost my way?" For the first time, the unwavering commander hesitated. "I believe you have changed." Nyxara let out a soft, mirthless laugh. "And that is enough to make me unfit to rule?" Dorian stepped beside her, his expression troubled. "It is enough to make them question." She closed her eyes briefly, inhaling the crisp, charged air. "They speak of removing you," he admitted, his voice low. The words did not surprise her. She turned to face him fully. "And where do you stand?" Dorian met her gaze, something unreadable flickering behind his golden irises. "I stand where I always have," he said finally. "Beside my queen." Nyxara studied him for a long moment before nodding. The storm was coming. She had known it the moment she had spared the human. Now, she would have to decide whether to fight against it or to embrace it. Gideon sat in the dimly lit chamber, the cold glow of the celestial technology reflecting off the polished floor beneath him. The air in the room was unnervingly still, thick with a silence that pressed against his ears like the vacuum of deep space. The walls pulsed faintly, as if the entire structure were alive, breathing around him. It was a stark contrast to the battlefield where he had spent most of his life. No blood, no death cries, no acrid scent of burning flesh and metal. And yet, here in this sterile chamber, he felt more uneasy than he ever had facing down an enemy. Across from him, Elise Carter stood rigid, her usual clinical detachment failing to mask the unease flickering behind her sharp blue eyes. A holoscreen hovered between them, its shifting displays filled with diagrams, sequences of data, his data. Gideon knew what he was looking at, even before she spoke. He just didn't want to believe it. "You're not fully human," she said at last, her voice carefully measured. "There's celestial DNA in your genome." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Gideon let out a sharp breath, shaking his head slightly. "That's not possible." Elise crossed her arms, glancing back at the holoscreen before turning to face him again. "It is. And it's not just a fragment. The integration is significant." He felt something in his chest tighten. "How?" She hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "I don't know for sure. But it's not natural. This wasn't something that happened over generations. This was deliberate. Deliberate." That word sank into him like a blade. He clenched his fists, his mind scrambling for a rational explanation, but none came. "Are you telling me someone experimented on me?" Elise's lips pressed into a thin line. "Or one of your ancestors. But the modifications are too precise, too controlled. Whoever did this," she motioned to the data, "knew exactly what they were doing." Gideon pushed himself to his feet abruptly, pacing the chamber. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, each step echoing too loudly in the confined space. His whole life, he had fought against them. Against their kind. Celestials. The enemy. The ones who had destroyed Earth, crushed humanity beneath their immortal rule. And now he wasn't even sure if he was one of them. He turned back to Elise, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Does she know?" Elise frowned. "Nyxara?" He gave a tight nod. Elise exhaled, rubbing the back of her neck. "I don't think so. If she did, I doubt she would have let you live." The thought didn't bring him any comfort. He didn't understand Nyxara. Not fully. She was unreadable, a creature of contradictions, merciless on the battlefield yet oddly restrained when it came to him. It had unnerved him from the start. And now this. His jaw clenched. "What does it mean?" Elise studied him for a moment before answering. "It means you're not just human, and it means you're not just celestial either." He swallowed hard. "Then what the hell am I?" She didn't have an answer. Gideon ran a hand down his face, his breath coming a little too fast. He had spent his entire life defined by one singular truth. He was a soldier, a human, fighting for the survival of his kind. He had bled for that cause, lost everything for it. And now the very foundation of who he was had been ripped out from under him. Elise took a cautious step forward. "Gideon, listen to me. I know this is—" But he was already moving, shoving past her and out of the chamber. The corridors of the celestial stronghold stretched before him, too smooth, too pristine. He needed air, space, something real to hold on to. He strode down the halls without purpose, ignoring the wary glances of the celestial guards as he passed. They still saw him as an outsider. A human. He wasn't sure if that was comforting or not. The great balcony of the palace opened before him, an expanse of dark metal and glass overlooking the city of Alaris. The skyline stretched far beyond the horizon, towers spiraling into the endless night, their golden veins pulsing faintly like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. He gripped the railing, breathing deep, trying to force the chaos in his head into some semblance of order. It wasn't working. He closed his eyes, willing the storm inside him to settle. But instead, another voice cut through the turmoil. "You look troubled." Nyxara. He didn't turn. He didn't trust himself to. She moved beside him, her presence both unnervingly still and overwhelming at once. "Something has unsettled you." He let out a hollow laugh. "You could say that." Silence stretched between them. Finally, he turned his head just enough to meet her gaze. "Tell me something," he said, voice low. "If you found out you weren't what you thought you were, if everything you believed about yourself was a lie, what would you do?" Nyxara's golden eyes studied him, sharp as ever. "The truth does not change what you are." He shook his head. "Doesn't it? If a lion finds out it was born of wolves, does it still belong to the pride? Or is it something else entirely?" She tilted her head slightly. "Do you believe you are no longer human?" "I don't know what the hell I am anymore," he admitted, the weight of those words heavier than he expected. She was quiet for a long moment. "You are still Gideon Kane." He huffed a breath, shaking his head. "That's not an answer. It is the only one that matters." He turned to face her fully. "And if I'm more like you than I am like them?" His voice was edged with something raw, something almost desperate. "What then?" Nyxara did not look away. "Then you will have to decide for yourself where you belong." His throat tightened. "And if I don't belong anywhere?" She studied him, her expression unreadable. Then, after a moment, she said, "Then you carve a place of your own." The words settled over him like a weight and a release all at once. She made it sound so simple. He knew it wasn't. But maybe, just maybe, she was right. Maybe it was time to stop trying to fit into a world that no longer existed for him, and start shaping the one that did. The truth had unraveled him. Gideon hadn't been able to sleep since Elise's revelation. It didn't matter how many times he replayed her words in his head. The reality refused to settle. He wasn't fully human. Celestial DNA was woven into his blood, his bones, his very existence. Someone had done this to him. Someone had turned him into this. And worst of all, he had no idea what it meant. For as long as he could remember, his purpose had been clear. He was a soldier, a survivor, a man fighting for humanity against an enemy that had crushed his kind without mercy. But now he didn't even know which side he belonged to. The unease gnawed at him like a disease, and when the attack came, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He fought. He had thrown himself into the battle without hesitation, pushing forward with reckless abandon. If Magnus wanted war, he would give him war. If he was destined to be something more than human, then let him prove his worth the only way he knew how. He didn't think. He didn't care. And that's why he didn't see the strike coming. One moment, he was cutting through enemy ranks, dodging plasma fire with movements that felt too precise, too fast, too unnatural. The next, a celestial blade tore into his side, slicing through armor, through flesh. The pain was instant, white-hot. His breath hitched as he stumbled, his vision darkening at the edges. His knees hit the ground. He heard voices, distant, panicked. The clash of weapons, the hum of energy blasts cutting through the air. Someone shouted his name. And then, she was there. Nyxara moved like a storm through the battlefield, her blade cutting down the Celestials who had struck him without hesitation. Her power rippled outward, golden energy crackling through the air like lightning. She reached him before anyone else, her expression unreadable. But her eyes burned with something he couldn't name. Stay awake, she ordered, kneeling beside him. His body felt like it was shutting down, his fingers cold despite the heat of the wound. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to smirk even as pain threatened to drag him under. Didn't think you'd care. Something flickered across her face, too quick to catch. Then she pressed her palm to his wound. Gideon had felt pain before. He had been beaten, burned, cut, broken. But nothing compared to this. Heat exploded from her touch, a rush of energy so powerful it stole his breath, his thoughts, his very sense of self. It wasn't just healing. It was something deeper, something ancient, something that felt like it was rewriting him from the inside out. His body arched off the ground as golden light flooded into him. He gasped, his pulse hammering, his veins igniting as if liquid fire coursed through them. It was her power, her essence. It was changing him. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. He collapsed, his breath ragged, his skin slick with sweat. His hands trembled as he lifted them, expecting to see blood, but instead, there was nothing. No wound, no pain. Just a lingering warmth beneath his skin, a faint golden glow that faded as quickly as it appeared. He was alive. But she was not the same. Nyxara swayed slightly where she knelt, her breath uneven, her skin paler than before. Her glow had dimmed. The energy that always surrounded her, that made her otherworldly, untouchable, unstoppable. It was weaker. Gideon's stomach twisted. "You gave me your power," he said, his voice hoarse. Nyxara exhaled slowly, composing herself before meeting his gaze. "You would have died." He pushed himself up, his muscles still trembling from the aftershock of what she had done. "You weakened yourself for me." She held his gaze, unreadable as ever. "Yes." The single word sent something sharp and dangerous through him. Nyxara had always been a force of nature, unshaken by war, by pain, by death itself. She did not give. She did not sacrifice. And yet, she had given this. She had chosen to save him, knowing what it would cost her. Gideon swallowed hard. Why? Her expression didn't change, but he saw it. The way her fingers curled into a fist. The way her breathing remained slightly uneven. The way she did not answer immediately. He already knew. Because he was not just a prisoner to her anymore. Because somewhere between battlefields and whispered words, something had shifted. Because she could not let him die. Nyxara turned away first, rising to her feet, her shoulders squared despite the weight pressing against her. In the distance, Magnus's forces were regrouping. The war wasn't over. And now, she was vulnerable. Gideon clenched his fists. She had saved him. But at what cost? He had a feeling they were about to find out. The air inside the celestial palace crackled with tension, thick with the scent of burning metal and the echoes of distant battle. The once pristine halls, so untouched by war for centuries, now bore the scars of betrayal. Smoke coiled along the gilded corridors, casting eerie shadows against the walls that pulsed faintly with golden energy. Gideon's breath came ragged as he sprinted beside Nyxara, his grip tight around the hilt of his stolen celestial blade. Footsteps pounded from all directions, the unmistakable march of Magnus's forces closing in around them. The coup had begun. They had barely made it out of the council chamber alive when the first explosion ripped through the capital, signaling Magnus's betrayal. The loyalist forces had been scattered, overwhelmed by the sheer brutality of Magnus's well-prepared attack. Half the city was already under his control. And now, he was coming for the throne. Nyxara's golden eyes burned as she cut down the enemies in their path, each movement precise, deadly, yet more measured than usual. She was slower, weaker, and Gideon knew why. Because she had given a part of herself to save him. His jaw clenched. This was his fault. A celestial soldier lunged at them from the side, his glaive flashing in the dim light. Gideon didn't think. He moved. He intercepted the blow, steel meeting steel in a blinding clash. The force of it sent a shockwave down his arm, but he held his ground. using the new strength coursing through his veins. He twisted, breaking the soldier's stance, and in a blur of motion, drove his blade through his enemy's chest. The Celestial fell without a sound. Gideon barely had time to register the kill before Nyxara grabbed his wrist, yanking him forward. "No time," she snapped. "More are coming." He followed without question. For once, there was no hesitation between them, no walls, no unspoken doubts. They moved like one, side by side, cutting through Magnus's forces, fighting as though they had been forged for this exact moment. The doors to the throne room loomed ahead, massive and carved from obsidian stone lined with veins of pulsing gold. Nyxara and Gideon burst through just as the last of their pursuers fell. The grand chamber stretched before them, silent, empty, waiting, except for him. Lord Magnus stood at the foot of the throne, his dark armor gleaming under the dim celestial light. He had been expecting them. "Nyxara," Magnus greeted, his voice rich with mockery. "You should have surrendered when you had the chance." She stepped forward, her presence unwavering despite the exhaustion lining her features. "You speak of surrender, yet you send assassins in the dark like a coward." Magnus smirked. "Coward, number pragmatist. You have lost your way, Nyxara. You have allowed weakness to take root in you. And now, look where it has brought you." His gaze flicked to Gideon, full of disdain. "You would throw away millennia of dominion for a mere human?" Gideon clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around his blade. He had spent years being underestimated by the Celestials. He would not let Magnus make that mistake again. Nyxara did not flinch. "Strength is not the absence of mercy." Magnus's smirk darkened. But mercy is the first step toward death." With a flick of his wrist, the throne room doors slammed shut, the air itself vibrating with power. The walls darkened, pulsing with contained energy. A battlefield sealed, inescapable. Magnus attacked first. He moved with terrifying speed, his blade cutting through the air in a streak of obsidian light. Gideon barely had time to react. He met the strike head-on, the impact sending a jarring shock through his arms. Magnus was stronger than any celestial he had faced before. Nyxara was already moving, her glaive spinning in a precise arc, her golden energy clashing against Magnus's darker power. Sparks rained down around them, the entire chamber trembling under the weight of their battle. Gideon fought alongside her, his every movement sharpened by the unnatural strength still lingering inside him. He should not have been able to keep up. And yet, he did. They fought as one. For every strike Magnus landed, Nyxara countered. For every opening he exposed, Gideon drove forward. Their movements synchronized in ways they had never trained for, a perfect balance of power and instinct. But Magnus was relentless. He struck low, twisting at the last second, and his blade tore through Gideon's side. Pain exploded through him. The force of the blow sent him crashing to the ground, the world spinning in a blur of light and sound. His breath caught, blood pooling beneath him. His vision blurred. He heard Nyxara scream his name. And then, everything changed. A blinding wave of golden energy erupted from her, the force of it knocking Magnus backward. Nyxara moved like a storm, her golden eyes burning brighter than ever before. She reached Gideon before he could slip away completely, her hands pressing against his wound. And then, he felt it. The warmth, the power, the life pouring into him again. But this time, it was different. The energy didn't just heal. It sank deeper. It spread through him like wildfire, like something awakening inside him that had always been there, waiting. Nyxara was giving more than before. Too much. "Stop," he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. She was weakening herself even further. She didn't stop. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, there was no distance between them. No war, no rivalry, no titles, just them. And she could not lose him. Magnus rose from where he had been thrown, his expression dark with fury. But something in his gaze shifted as he looked at them, at Gideon, at what he was becoming. And for the first time, Magnus hesitated. The power inside Gideon did not fade this time. It remained, pulsing beneath his skin like something newly born, something unstoppable. Nyxara's hands trembled against him, her breathing unsteady. "You are not finished yet, Gideon Kane." And he knew. Neither was she. The final battle had only just begun. The throne room was a battlefield. Smoke curled from shattered pillars, golden embers flickering in the cracks of the fractured obsidian floor. The once glorious chamber, where celestial rulers had dictated the fate of galaxies for millennia, now bore the scars of war, of betrayal. And in the center of it all, Lord Magnus stood, still breathing, still fighting. His dark armor was cracked but not broken, his glaive still thrumming with power. He was not defeated. Not yet. Gideon's heart pounded as he tightened his grip on his weapon, his pulse thrumming in time with the unfamiliar golden energy coursing beneath his skin. His body still felt wrong, different, more than human, but less than celestial. He didn't have time to question it. Not now. Nyxara stood beside him, her breath uneven, her glow dimmer than ever before. She had already given too much, and Magnus knew it. "You're weaker than I thought, Nyxara." Magnus's voice cut through the silence, mocking, calculating. His gaze flicked to Gideon, filled with cold contempt. "And you, whatever you've become, are an abomination." Gideon smirked, rolling his shoulders, feeling the residual heat of Nyxara's power still lingering in his veins. "I get that a lot." Magnus's expression darkened. "This is where your reign ends, Nyxara. This is where I take what should have been mine." And then he struck. Magnus moved faster than Gideon expected, a blur of obsidian and fury. His glaive cut through the air with devastating precision, slicing toward Nyxara's weakened form. She raised her weapon to block, but the impact sent her skidding backward, her feet barely catching the floor in time. She wasn't at full strength, and Magnus knew it. Gideon didn't think. He moved. His body reacted before his mind could catch up, stepping between Magnus and Nyxara, intercepting the next blow. Metal clashed with metal, the force rattling through his bones, but he held. "You think you can stand against me, human?" Magnus sneered, pressing his blade down. Gideon clenched his jaw, muscles straining. He wasn't just human anymore, and Magnus had no idea what he was dealing with. The power inside Gideon surged, wild, untamed, but his. With a roar, he shoved Magnus back, his strength sending shockwaves through the air. Magnus stumbled, momentary shock flashing across his face. He hadn't expected resistance. Gideon didn't give him time to recover. He lunged, his movements faster, sharper, unnatural. He fought as he always had, but with something more. For every strike Magnus landed, Gideon countered. For every opening Magnus created, Nyxara took it. She moved with him, not just beside him. They weren't fighting as two warriors anymore. They were one. Their attacks flowed together, perfectly synchronized. Nyxara's glaive met Magnus's blade, Gideon striking where she forced an opening. It wasn't just skill, it was something else, something neither celestial nor human had ever seen before. Magnus growled, frustration bleeding into his expression. "What are you?" Gideon smiled grimly, still figuring that out. But Magnus was far from finished. With a snarl, he twisted his weapon in a sudden, brutal arc, aimed straight at Nyxara. She didn't have time to block. Gideon saw the strike coming a second before it happened, and he reacted without thinking. His body moved before his mind did. He threw himself in front of her. The glaive slammed into his chest. A flash of white-hot pain exploded through him. He hit the ground hard, his vision flickering, the taste of iron filling his mouth. Nyxara's scream ripped through the chamber. Something snapped. The air crackled, raw and electric. Magnus barely had time to react before Nyxara moved like a force of nature unleashed. Golden light erupted from her in violent waves, the very fabric of the throne room shattering under the weight of her fury. She struck without hesitation, without restraint, without mercy. Her glaive found its mark. Magnus's eyes widened in shock as the weapon drove through his chest, piercing straight through his armor. Golden energy pulsed through the wound, tearing him apart from the inside out. His lips parted in silent disbelief. Then, he fell. The ground trembled as his body hit the floor, the last of his power flickering like dying embers. The rebellion was over. The war was over. And yet, Gideon was still dying. Nyxara dropped beside him, her hands pressing against his wound. But the damage was too great. He felt cold. No, she whispered, her voice raw, desperate. Gideon let out a weak chuckle. Didn't think you cared. She shook her head fiercely. You do not get to die, Gideon Kane. And then, she did something reckless. She pressed her palm flat against his chest, pouring what remained of her strength into him. Energy surged through him, but this time it wasn't just healing. It was transformation. Gideon gasped as the power consumed him. His body, his very cells, changed. He wasn't just being saved. He was becoming something new, something impossible. The golden energy faded, leaving only silence. Gideon was alive. But he was not the same. His fingers curled into fists, the golden veins beneath his skin no longer flickering, but permanent. Nyxara swayed beside him, exhaustion evident in every breath. He caught her before she could collapse. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Neither human, neither celestial. Something in between. Something undeniably connected. She swallowed hard. What happens now? Gideon exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the future pressing down on them. I don't know, he admitted. But whatever it is. He tightened his grip on her hand. We face it together. And for the first time in his life, Gideon Kane was not alone. For the first time, neither was she. And that changed everything. He was no longer just a man. She was no longer just a queen. Together, they were something new. A force that neither humans nor celestials could ever predict. This was more than just a war. More than a battle for power. This was the birth of something the universe had never seen before. What will become of them? What future awaits a love forged in war, tested by betrayal, and reborn in the unknown? One thing is certain. Their story is only beginning. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching until the very end. Your support means everything. If you enjoyed this epic tale, leave a like, share this with fellow sci-fi lovers, and subscribe to Alien Love Chronicles for more stories that will transport you beyond the stars. See you in the next journey across the galaxies. Until then, remember, love knows no boundaries.